and we're on.
Hello, good morning everyone, and special good morning to our guests from the United States. We have two guests, so big thanks to you that you decided to join us. It's very early in the US. In Poland is noon. Marcin Walecki is a little bit closer, but still it's before noon. And I welcome all participants who watch us. And today is the second day of I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit awkward, but second day of celebrating Anti-Corruption Day, International Anti-Corruption Day, which was yesterday. But we decided to continue the topic and try to discuss links between pandemic and corruption. This is a difficult question, but I am sure we will deal with it today. We have top researchers in the topic of corruption, anti-corruption policies, really top worldwide known researchers among us. Before we will go to questions to our speakers, and to if not, I will be happy to ask as a moderator, but also please feel free to ask questions between us in the panel. And then we will close our session with some closing remarks, and I'm sure that we'll use our time effectively. And yes, so after this this introduction, I would like to ask you two general questions in this first round. I'm sorry. These two general questions I would like to ask. First of them is the question from the perspective of the global anti-corruption policy. During recent years, previous years, I mean, the whole world developed a lot of anti-corruption tools, conventions, new institutions. We have more and more anti-corruption institutions in the European Union. We have now new conditionality mechanism that will be applied to in the European Union. So it seems that it might seem that we are quite well prepared to react to corruption risks. And now we have pandemic. So my first general question to all of you is, I mean, were we prepared? I mean, having this all anti-corruption infrastructure to the situation that we are facing now, or not? I would love to hear what you think about this. And the second general question is how pandemic links to rule of law and to the condition of democracy, liberal democracy. How do you think? I mean, in the recent years, we also witnessed that there are more and more countries, unfortunately Poland belongs to them, Hungary belongs to them, that are declining in terms of democracy. And the regimes that we have in Poland or in Hungary seem to be more and more illiberal and autocratic. And pandemic, will it deepen this problem, or it will be threat to this more and more illiberal autocratic regimes? Is this kind of window of opportunity for us to reform democracy? So these are two general questions I would like to ask, and knowing that that you have, all of you have your own specializations, I would like also to ask to each of you a specific question, and we are starting from from Alina Mugiu-Pippidi from Hertie School of Governance. Alina is a distinguished professor of Hertie School of Governance. She is also civic activist and a researcher, very experienced researcher in corruption and anti-corruption policy. And starting from you and having in mind these two general questions, I would like also to ask you about the new tool that you developed recently to measure quality of governance and risk of corruption. How does it tool work? I mean, it was created before the pandemic, but maybe it shows something already something to us about circumstances that we are now facing. And how do you think? I mean, can we predict also by use of this tool and other tools? I mean, what will happen? I know that this is difficult question, but let's try to start from it. And let's start from Alina. Floor is yours, virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Grzegorz. It's a pleasure to see everyone. I only agreed to open this panel because we were afraid that our overseas guest will not be able to connect in time. But now I am stuck with the lead position, it seems. So let me answer this your general question first before sort of embarking into showing you what is the knowledge infrastructure that we try to build in order to help governments react faster, and donors in particularly, to react faster in such situations. So first, I would say that, we have a very old discussion in the anti-corruption community if corruption is harmful or not. Because beyond being immoral, corruption really has to be harmful in order to qualify as a public policy problem. There are a lot of immoral things out there, but governments do not really plan budgets or mobilize human forces to fight against them. And if corruption is harmful or not, although it might seem very obvious to some people, is not so obvious. It has been the object of many debates. And during decades, there's been some shift between the dominant group who believed that corruption is, in fact, helpful to make the machinery of the government work, to those like us who think that corruption, in fact, is harmful. And during these times, even before these pandemics struck us, there was this very big debate between, on one hand, Frank Fukuyama, and on the other hand, people like me or Bo Rothstein, with Frank Fukuyama arguing that corruption is not the most detrimental things for government. And who cares in the end of the day if a government is corrupt, if a government has enough capacity, as China does, for economic growth, and as we have seen during this pandemic, actually to very, very effectively, even if ruthlessly, to prevent the spread of an epidemic in a country. On the other hand, people like me who speak a little bit more from within corrupt countries, because for listeners who might not know me, I'm a professor in Germany, but I am Romanian. So I'm one of the millions and millions of people with insight on how corrupt countries work. And I always argued, and Bo, I think, supported me on this, that it is just impossible at systematic corruption to have sufficient capacity to manage a health system, even in a sunny day, let alone in a pandemic, right? And I think that, if I just look at my own country, you immediately see what happened since the pandemic started, a mixture of phenomena that I can only define as tragicomic. The manager of the first hospital, the whole hospital got infected. It was the first casualty of the epidemics, not the patients, but everyone, nurses, doctors, absolutely everyone. The army came and took over the hospital. It came out that the hospital manager, who was politically appointed, in fact, had absolutely no experience with any sort, not that he wasn't a doctor. Of course, he wasn't a doctor, but he hadn't in his life work in health management at all. He was just a political appointment. He had no idea what an epidemics were. He didn't know what to do, right? The first person who was in charge nationally, a Secretary of State of the Ministry of Health. He was a model, a male model, but a model. How did we find out this immediately? I mean, of course, when things started to go badly, people immediately researched him, and then they discovered that his photographs, he was a very nice looking man, were all over Facebook, because this is what he praised himself with being a handsome man who wore clothes for money. Okay, and he was Secretary of State in charge of all this. Of course, competent people also existed, and they do exist in Romania, but it was a bit more difficult, and it took a while until the government understood that, at least in a circumstance like this, you have to empower people who understand and who know what they're doing, right? Because that's not the everyday situation in a country like this. However, I will immediately plead on the other side, okay? I owe it to Frank, who was very much redeemed in his arguments by these pandemics, to say that if Boris Johnson handled badly the transition, or if Donald Trump handled badly the transition, it is not due to corruption, in the United States or in UK. And if you look across the countries, there is no obvious correlation between how you performed during the pandemics and how corrupt you are. Although I would actually argue that there is a correlation between meritocracy of the leaders and the extent to which leaders of countries believe in evidence-based policymaking and are promoting merit as leaders of their government, and how the country fared. This would be my argument. But where I think Frank is right is when he made his argument that, in fact, what the pandemics proved was that good enough governance and not integrity-based governance, in the end of day, carried this pandemic. And his argument roughly is that what matters is that a social contract exists. Now, how do you arrive at this social contract? And in particular, the question which for us, I mean, my title is Democracy Chair. So of course, I am one of the people who professionally promote democracy. For me, it's difficult to accept, but his argument is that it doesn't matter if leaders are elected or not. What matters is if a social contract exists between the leaders, the government, the ruling elites, whoever is in government, and the population, and sufficient trust exists for people to follow the lead. Because you really need trust in order to respect a lockdown, respect the mask requirement, respect all this. So this is Frank's argument that a social contract was proven to be very strong in Asia, for instance, for countries which are definitely not democracies, countries like China, countries like Vietnam, and on the other hand, of course, in all democracies more like Germany, democracies like South Korea, right? And the jury is still out who performed better. But, in the end of the day, I think that both sides of the argument can advance bringing evidence, because in the end of the day, Vietnam has a far smaller rate of fatality than Germany does. And Germany is seen as Europe as the best performer. Now, what I found very, very interesting in this, again, for those of you who know me and knows that I worked in the last 10 years a lot on achievers, on the countries which have managed in the past 30, 40 years to advance from systematic corruption to a situation where corruption is an exception. And there are very few countries like this. And by now, I guess you all know them, simply by how many times I bored you in different international conferences with this lot of countries, or for my many books and publications on this. And I was very impressed that some of these new achievers, in fact, all of them, to be honest, perform better than old achievers, than historical achievers, as I call them, countries which reached good governance in the 19th century. So who are my new achievers? Well, they're the South Korea. South Korea has always been my case with the largest number of populations in my new achievers, because otherwise my new achievers are kind of small countries. And this is frequently what people say when I present them this very short list. which I can argue they're the only achievers globally. People say, okay, but they only have 2 million population. I mean, what kind of a country is that? We could all do it if we only have 2 million population. Of course, this is nonsense, because I can point to a lot of countries of 1 million populations who are still systematically corrupt, but nevertheless, I was always glad of South Korea because they have this large population. And South Korea has been exemplary, right? Taiwan, which is another of my achievers, they've been great. They've been very good. Uruguay, they've been fabulous. Estonia, they've been very good. So, in other words, if I would say that a global correlation between corruption and fatality, mortality, incidence, all the statistics associated with the epidemics does not hold, if in fact you look at, if you correlate transitions to good governance and you see who has been doing well recently, in other words, they were in the exercise of improving their governance, of trying to score on governance effectiveness as well as integrity, because these things go hand in hand. You cannot separate them. These are countries which really, really are on top of the world these days, and they have really shown that there is a good governance dividend, didn't they? Now, this being said, the number of these countries is too small. And it's very, very easy to say that Uruguay is doing well. I mean, in the end of the day, I think even if they were not popular enough, I think everyone knowledgeable knew that they were doing very well, or Estonia is doing very well, or countries like this. So the problem, and I'm going to try to share screen only briefly with you here, the problem was that although we had a few achievers, nevertheless, the problem is with the rest of the world. I mean, you cannot go around saying that, okay, we have 7 countries which manage it in the past 40 years, and for the rest, all the other countries, where we all work, are actually not countries where anything positive is happening. I put out the wrong slide shares. You probably see them, but that is not really helpful. So just bear with me for a second. So in order to solve this problem, what we did is that we tried to come up with a more refined way of tracing change. Because the problem is that even if countries improve or not improve, and even in normal days when you are not so tested as we have been tested with this pandemic, nevertheless, change is very hard to grasp. Of course, it's hard to grasp due to our perception indicators, because perception indicators have this very, very big leg, being roughly averages. So everything which falls in their standard deviation between various components, you cannot be sure it's change. It may just be noise. And we know that Daniel Kaufman calculated for the World Bank, and it's actually more than 2/3 noise. So if I see, for instance, that Romania has made some progress over the past 10 years, but the progress is within the confidence error on the World Bank, then it's very likely that it's noise and it's not really progress. So you need to have very big progress to be sure that it's progress. And this is why we traveled around to a different approach, in which we no longer looked at these perception indicators, but we rather looked at their determinants. We looked at this basket of proxies, which put together explain corruption in all the countries in the world, however you proxy corruption, through procurement figures, or through perception indicators, or through expert surveys, or through global corruption barometer, because we tested all that. So we know we have these big factors, right? And out of these factors, we have selected long ago, 5 years ago, the most effective proxies in the Index for Public Integrity. Now, what did we do is that we took these disaggregated factors, which are most of them fact-based, except judicial independence, for 10 years. And we looked at them for 10 years in order to understand a little bit, not only why, if countries changes or not, but why might this happen? But then, of course, it is depressing to predict countries just based on 10 years trends. You can do this, of course. But fortunately, contingencies exist. The world is full of, unexpected things which might happen, like this pandemic. And these unexpected things may sometimes, push a country back, but actually they may also, who knows, push a country forward. So what we did is that we created this innovative methodology, which is open for discussion because it's very new. There is no other forecast of governance in the world except this one, okay? So imperfect as it is, we take it as some sort of basis to build on. So we look at 10 years disaggregated trends in IPI components. Then we look at recent political contingencies. What happened in the country, right? Is this country actually a country where there is demand for good governance? For instance, like in Slovakia, an outsider completely gets elected as president on an anti-corruption ticket. Because even if the 10 years trends are not very good, if something like this happens, I would weight the 10-year trends by an event such as this. Finally, we are weighting again qualitatively by another important thing, which is what is the permanent demand for good governance? What is this country's equipment with strong citizens, with demanding citizens, with what we call digital citizens in IPI language? In other words, a combination of internet household connections and people associated through social media, which is a proxy for collective action, right? And putting all these three things together, we have in fact managed to trace more change. So we now have 19 countries, which in fact we forecast that they will change positively in the next years. We also have 10 countries that we forecast will regress. And we have over 100 countries that we forecast they will stay where they are, which of course it's a very different result for countries which are in a good place versus countries which are in a bad place. Now, just a few examples, and I'll finish with some of our countries since we started, okay? So as you can see, Estonia, Korea were already forecast by us as doing fairly well. And we forecast that they are going to continue to do well and manage through this. But there are other countries which are really more problematic. Peru, for instance. Peru and in Latin America, Peru and Colombia, they have some of the 6 indicators for the 10 years positive. They have been OECD applicants and therefore they made a lot of reforms. So if you look at what is easier to do, like streamline some legislation and something, they've been doing some of it, improving fiscal transparency, okay? On the other hand, Colombia, we forecast to be negative because their judicial independence has constantly been going down and because there is no clear force, there is no coalition around a very clear good governance program in Colombia. So we said, no, Colombia is not going to manage. But Peru, we forecasted positively because a number of things happening there in the last 2 years, despite very severe structural constraints in Peru, seem to side with us. But then what happened after the pandemic is that Peru was very hard hit due to these structural constraints, right? It's a country with 70% vulnerable employment, and people were asked, and of course, very few subscriptions to the official health insurance plan. But of course, you do not go to a country doctor for corona. You have to go to ATI, you have to go to intensive therapy, and people were asked to buy themselves their oxygen tube and come with it to the hospital. So the country was very severely exposed, and in the midst of this, a conservative majority of the parliament, by conservative, I really do not understand conservative in a British sense, but the pro-corruption, pro-establishment conservative majority suspended the anti-corruption president. So for a second, it seemed to me that our forecast was completely blown apart. And my Peruvian students, of course, were crying their eyes out, and everyone in Peru was sending emails. But they managed to come around. They managed to create a transition process, and they managed to put a president who's a reformer and who didn't have any majority, but simply the pressure of the street that you have all seen on TVs. So the pressure on the street, as I would have forecast, as it was my number 3 element, the digital citizens, the pressure on the street managed to secure a transition which is good. And at the end of which is elections. Okay, now will they be able to have a construction that's sometimes more difficult to have, a good political vehicle than just creating a revolution? That I do not know, but I think that Peru is still fighting and it's on a good track. My other example is Brazil. Brazil performed terribly during the transition. So I would say I was entirely wrong on Brazil. And Michael Johnson, who was the #1 reviewer of this, I didn't create this course, but we were all wrong on this Brazil. Only I do not think we were wrong on Brazil. Again, I think the jury is still out. Yes, Bolsonaro has been a terrible manager, so have been Trump and Boris Johnson. But on the other hand, look what happened during the transition. You know, his own health ministers went against him. A judiciary indicted his son. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. You know, the son of a general who's also a president in a period of this. So, you know, I think that our mechanism, you can go on and click on every country on this map. That's how it works. I can click on Poland, for instance, and with this I have to end. You know, I can click on Poland, and what comes out when you do this comes out where Poland is on Index for Public Integrity. You see a little bit of the trends in Poland here back on the last 10 years, the main trends. There are more trends that you can find if you click on the Excel table, where you will see the whole data behind. Everything is very transparent. If you disagree with what we wrote here on Poland, please use this feedback form and tell us this is nonsense. Please attach your own data, and we will definitely use all these reviews to revise the text and credit you. But in the end of the day, you know, for instance, I did not forecast that Poland is going to go down. You know, I forecast that Hungary is not going well, but I forecast that Poland will fight it. I didn't forecast that Poland is going to go well. I just forecast that in Poland, nothing is going to change over the next year, which might not be, you know, very good news, but is better news that if Poland would backslide. So everything, the explanation, why that is, what is actually missing, what is Poland doing right, what is Poland doing wrong, from a good governance perspective, you know, not from everything. I'm not looking at everything. You can find here, okay? That's not a solution for everyday coronavirus management, but it is a solution for people who try to put their good governance strategies on some evidence basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. We extended a little bit your time, but we are comfortable. Next, I would like to move to Nikos Passas, professor of criminology and criminal justice. You may find his full bio on the website of the conference. I just will highlight one interesting fact from Nikos Passas bio is that he knows 6 languages, and I'm wondering if you know Polish, but I don't think so.
I have actually done 6 other fluent languages. I have done actually 2 years of Polish.
Wow.
And that's not one of the 6 though.
But don't be afraid. I'm not expecting you will deliver your speech in Polish. But yes, I mean, just to remind a little bit, these 2 general questions. I mean, were we prepared with all our anti-corruption tools? I mean, to what happens under COVID? This is the first general question in short. The second was, I mean, will pandemic strengthen anti-democratic trends and anti-democratic regimes, illiberal regimes? This is second general question. And I know while we were preparing to this webinar that you already started analysis and research on links between corruption and pandemic. I know that it's very early and too early to say too much. I mean, what is the picture? But I know that you are doing it already, and you already have some thoughts, I mean, about the specificity of COVID corruption, if I can call it like this. So indeed, please, Professor Nicos.
Thank you so much. And it is indeed some specificities and also some general patterns, because crises of all types and their effects are far less random or unexpected as they may first appear. Actions and inactions of decision makers cause or distribute or contribute to crisis by worsening or alleviating their effects. Sometimes disasters are welcome and taken advantage for political or business purposes. We have seen the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism literature in that respect. But invariably, when there is a crisis and claims of urgency, we have power exercise and interests pursued. and some more than others, and some more equal than others. And to me, that is the essence of the quality of governance. How well are these interests articulated, acted out, and resolved when they conflict? And that is the yardstick that I use beyond legal definitions of corruption or perceptions of the problem. To me, more important problems are when the collective interest that someone is elected or appointed to serve is undermined by private interests. So what we're having is an abuse, de facto or intentional, of an office, power, or authority for a private interest. And that includes practices that I have described in the past as lawful but awful, when you look at the effects of certain practices in both public and private sectors. And these effects may be, in fact, worse than what we call organized crime sometimes. And so there is a whole lot of literature, and that is very similar to what Janine has done with her work on unaccountable institutions and actors who get away with what they are doing. There is also the literature on institutional corruption, where you do not have any legal law violation, but what you have is the institutional purpose, such as public health, is undermined in practice by influences, by decisions, by actions, or by activities, or the trust in these institutions that are critical is damaged, and trustworthiness in these institutions is undermined. So I will have three tales to tell, but the point about this pandemic is that it's revealing and exacerbating problems that we knew about. And because it has reached every corner of the earth, it is indeed an unprecedented opportunity to engage in comparative studies in the quality of governance in three ways, on three levels. Preparedness. What we see already is how diversely they were prepared to protect their citizens. How good and equitable was the public health system? How laws and regulation incentivized preparedness in medicine, equipment like PPE, infrastructure, and etc. Second level is how they responded when it hit. Denial, neglect, anti-scientism, lockdowns, government interventions in markets, all kinds of areas where we have opportunities to research and see how the response was appropriate or inappropriate by the standard of serving the public interest, looking at the effects, the consequences, which are much more objective and obstinate than opinions. And finally, the third level is what is the likely likely consequence of policy reforms and measures introduced now in the future? How long-term are they going to be? And here I'm referring to surveillance technologies, surveillance capitalism, emergency measures, powers, debt management, and as unprecedented printing is taking place in central banks and governments are borrowing like there is no tomorrow. And how is that distributed? That is where inequalities are exacerbated. That is where power grabs are taking place. And that is where opportunities for fraud and criminal enterprises are emerging. And this is very similar, to just draw some parallels with other historical events. Other emergencies like that are accompanied by rule of law breakdowns, security problems, fraud, corruption, and serious crime of all types. Look at the tsunamis in Southeast Asia and South Asia, the earthquakes in Pakistan, in Haiti, and Mexico, floods and hurricanes, Katrina in the United States, or Sandy, or Houston floodings, famine and conflict emergencies in Somalia and other parts of Africa, wars and reconstructions like Iraq and Afghanistan, embargo and sanctions regimes. Look at the historical background in South Africa, Israel, Iraq, Iran, DPRK, and so on. So The corrupt and the desperate take advantage of emergency situations, and attention to speed and health issues lowers our guard. Some controls are further weakened by physical distancing and lockdowns at a time when substantial financial resources are deployed to support the economy. So here we have criminal law violations. So we have the good old bribery, abuse of power, trading in influence, nepotism, clientelism, and so on. We have the lawful but awful practices, and we have institutional corruption. And let me give you 3 areas of inquiry that highlight some of this problem. The meatpacking and food processing industry, because as you saw, I emphasized not only public office, but also private office can be abused. We can have private corruption as well. And the quality of governance affects also private sector, NGOs, international organizations, science, academics, media, everyone, right? So when you look at the meatpacking industry, there were all kinds of warnings in the past about how the physical workplace lends itself to spreading of disease. It is a vulnerable environment. That's something that we know about. By the way, all of the pandemic, it was Fauci in 2017 that actually predicted that we were going to have a crisis like this. Laurie Garrett has been writing for 15 years about the coming pandemic. Another book, The Spillover, has been telling us about viruses jumping from the natural environment to humans. There's nothing new about this. So the question is, what have we done without it? And the meatpacking and food processing industry were made aware of that, and there were rules and regulations about how you prepare for that. They were not enforced properly. In fact, what we had was President Trump signing an executive order on the 28th of April, declaring meatpacking plants as critical infrastructure and forcing them to remain open. The Attorney General Becerra, who's becoming a cabinet member in the new administration, actually criticized as reckless this executive order. Interesting about this executive order is also that emails show that the meatpacking industry drafted the executive order and sent it to Washington to keep them open. Another investigation found out how CDC investigators went to find out the conditions and make recommendations, strong recommendations on what the industry should do. They went back, wrote the report. The report was approved by the health departments in the concerned states in the Midwest. And then there was pressure on them to revise that report and relax the language to make it optional. And there is still investigation into that, but orders came from a high office in the CDC. Then what we had is workers in food plants dying. 4 were died in a particular plant. I don't need to disclose names at this point, but the company was fined $13,494. That is how much, that kind of penalty that we had here. And ProPublica did an investigation and quotes a CEO describing social distancing as a nicety that makes sense only for people with laptops. What's the bottom line consequences that I wanted to emphasize? According to data collected as of yesterday, mid-noon, at least 1,231 meatpacking and food processing plants and 269 farms and production facilities have had confirmed COVID-19 cases. At least 75,244 workers have tested positive, and at least 340 of them have died. So this kind of institutional neglect or corruption kills. Then look at the pharmaceutical industry and health science. the second line of inquiry. Now, there is a long list of articles that have pointed out how pharmaceutical companies often in the past have hidden, ignored, or misrepresented evidence about new drugs, distorted medical literature, misrepresented products to prescribing physicians, causing all kinds of ill effects to patients. That's in addition to recent scandals that I also work in a different place from my birthplace. I am from Greece, and we're still reeling from the Novartis bribery scandal there, which was not just a Greek incident. And we have seen malpractices also with respect to good old corruption. When it comes to the health industry, we have industry lobbyists or players in the administration that is managing the healthcare crisis. We have a lobbyist for one of the from one of the companies for Gilead that was named to a top position at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. We have a former president of Eli Lilly overseeing the efforts for drug pricing and as Secretary of Health and Human Services. But more importantly, with respect to health, let's make it COVID-19 related. I will just cite for you a few things that are being debated in the medical and health science community right now. It was announced that 95% is the efficacy of the new vaccines, and therefore we need the authorization for emergency use very quickly. So what is pointed out in BMJ, the scientific peer review journal, is that this is the relative risk reduction percentage, 95%. The relative, the absolute rather risk reduction percentage is less than 1%. And that is because the number of actual COVID-19 cases in the samples that were used, placebo and vaccine arms, were actually very small. A point is raised about what is the endpoint in the trials. And the endpoint, the primary endpoint of the trials as conducted now is any severity of COVID-19 as opposed to the ability of the vaccine to save lives, reduce the severity of symptoms, reduce transmission, reduce the need for hospital stay or medical interventions, or shorten the course of the illness. Some say that instead of emergency use approval, more appropriate is the expanded access approval, which keeps the trials going, the scientific review ongoing, and the sharing of the results also, as opposed to closing down the trials and wrapping up trials, which is a risk. There is also no data on long-term efficacy, 3, 6, or 12 months. We haven't had the time yet. They have fragile groups have been excluded from our trials, the elderly, immunocompromised, pregnant women, people under the age of 17. In one of the cases, the under 17s trial is about to start. There is also concern about unblinding of research. There is supposed to be integrity in research by having a blind both who gets the placebo, who gets the arm. So the patients, the volunteers do not know, and the researchers do not know. But there are all kinds of protocol risks, because people are told that if they get the vaccine, they are likely to have headaches, fever, chills, muscle pains, and so on. And not to worry, this can be an effect of the vaccine. So that tells them that they got the vaccine. And the question is that the effect of the vaccine, or is that the possibility of symptoms that they get later? Testing will tell us that. Yet, doctors are called to use subjective judgments on whether the subjects are to be tested or not, which means that it is possible that some cases will not be counted. So the bottom line is this: we need data to be made public for transparency and public scrutiny and independent review. And the problem is that rushed approvals and these concerns that are within the medical community play into the anti-vaxxer hands. They limit the uptake of vaccine and they harm future trust in vaccines and government health policies. And the final story is about governments. We are talking about what the government did before the vaccine. And we had, in fact, plenty of warnings, public knowledge. I was able to monitor what Italian doctors were sharing with their colleagues in Europe about what is coming. I was able to read this. I don't have intelligence access. The PPE handling was a disaster. The response was with denial, disinformation, no masks, parties at the White House, all kinds of competition, divisions, even modern piracy has been charged against the US government. And what I have called neo-socialist interventions in the market. We have austerity for the many and trillions of dollars for the few, leading to an embarrassing dislocation between the stock market, which is sky high at a record level, and the real economy, where you have millions of people begging for federal aid, state and local governments. Hospitals are at breaking point. And the CARES Act is expiring with millions of gig workers, freelancers, and long-term unemployed losing their benefits. So what we have here is the simple conclusion. We have neoliberalism for the many and neo-socialism for the few. What we need is actually consistent application of what our policy is and transparency on how it is executed. We need science with conscience, and we need conscience with science. Collective conscience or individual conscience cannot happen without science. Science is part of the word conscience. If you take science out of conscience, what you're left with is con men and con artists and disinformation. So intended or not, allowed or prohibited, consistent or inconsistent with an entity's particular goals, those are problems that call for policy attention. And whether we are going to weather this storm well or not depends on us. It's our duty to analyze this, to decipher this, to articulate the views, put them up for debate, and act on this, because yes, it is an opportunity for a better tomorrow, and resilience is not a return to the old normal, but actually improving ourselves and creating a better society for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. It was extremely interesting, and you picked up many interesting elements of all this situation. For me, the most interesting thing that you said is the last thing about this neoliberalism for few and new socialism for most of us. And I started thinking, I mean, how much close we are to some bigger social conflict that we had, for example, already had in early 90s and not early 90s, sorry. Late 90s and 2000, when we had big anti-global protests. For now, we don't have it, but we will see, because this difference between what is going on stock market and what is going on the ground is I think it's really important point. Another thing that I'm happy that we picked up is legal corruption. I mean, I'm happy that you mentioned that corruption simply can be legalized, and this is what happened in many countries. But I'm quite sure that we are kind of leader under pandemic. I mean, Poland in these terms. We have unique provisions that were adopted under pandemic that simply make politicians and public officials impune for breaches of the law and illegal purchases and many other actions that if they argue that everything was done to fight pandemic. And we have whole story with elections that were very controversial, presidential elections. As you may know, the first elections that we had in May this year actually didn't happen because the government wanted to have these elections as quick as possible. So they adopted the law that created possibility to organize the whole elections in a by the post office, but in the end it didn't happen. So we had regular elections in July. And with this, I would like to go to Janine Wedel, another experienced researcher and also commentator on corruption and quality of public life and integrity. Janine has a long record in this area, and not only with many books focused on corruption, but also on Poland, because Janine is also linked to Poland. You didn't mention in your bio your one of the first book or even first book. I mean, please correct me. The Private Poland. So this is why this is also, I think, can be interesting for the people watching us from Poland. But your specialization is to track what you call shadow elites and how shadow elites influence decision-making processes, policies, and as you point out, often again, I mean, they often work on the basis of the legal corruption. They use the practices that are not illegal, but in the end they might be. In the end, we might witness also crime, and yeah, I mean what do you think? I mean, is pandemic the situation that, I mean, already Nikos mentioned it. I mean, lobbying, different industries that use this situation for their own interest. What are your observations on pandemic and corruption, and from your point of view of analysis, Janine? Please unmute yourself, or yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to be back in Poland, so to speak. It's the only place in the world where I really have name recognition, because every Pole will know that my last name, Wedel, is synonymous with the chocolate enterprise that is like Coca-Cola in Poland. So although I'm not of Polish background, I spent a number of years in Poland in the 1980s and 90s. So it is a special home and place for me. And as Grzegorz pointed out, my very first book was The Private Poland, and all about the Polish ways and means of getting things done when you couldn't do them officially. So it was about the underground or the informal system. And I have 3 points in response to Grzegorz's 3 questions for the panelists and for me specifically. And the first one is that builds on what Nikos has just said, and it has to do with states of emergency, so-called declared states of emergency, states of exception, or states of crisis. And I think it's very useful to place the pandemic in that space, in that context, and to understand that these states of exception, so-called, have become more common. They've become more common, more declared since the end of the Cold War, and specifically since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which established emergency legislation enabling the surveillance, much more surveillance on regular people, and the erosion of civil liberties that otherwise might not have been possible or tolerated. And this is, of course, true not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world. So what do states of emergency enable leaders to do? Well, as Nikos has alluded to, they're enabled to do authoritarian things, to take measures that consolidate their power that otherwise would have been difficult or impossible. And they create opportunities for the erosion of all manner of oversight, of course. So for instance, state of emergency has been mentioned as declared by Viktor Orban in Hungary, enabling him to rule by decree and imprison journalists for 5 years for disseminating false news. Similar situation in the Philippines with the president there, has given himself powers to silence so-called fake news. COVID-19 has facilitated greater censorship in China, Thailand, Cambodia, Venezuela, Bangladesh, and Turkey, according to Human Rights Watch report. It has limited political demonstrations in Algeria, Russia, and India, and it has intensified digital surveillance in China, South Korea, Israel, and Russia. So these are some of the quick cases from around the world. So, and emergency, my third point that is often made about states of emergency is that they have a way of becoming more permanent. They're not going to necessarily go away when the condition that supposedly enabled them that enabled them in the first place disappears. And I think we've seen many examples of that with regard to the post 9/11 state of emergency and surveillance. So in answer to Grzegorz's one of Grzegorz questions, yes, the pandemic has absolutely created opportunities for authoritarian leaders and regimes to strengthen themselves. And this brings me to Grzegorz's second question, and my second point. He asks whether the global anti-corruption community and policy were sufficiently prepared to deal with corruption that the pandemic has engendered. Well, I think overall we've seen not really. I have been watching how in the United States, how quickly, though, anti-corruption organizations did activate themselves and what they've been focusing on. And I think, so I did a scan of my emails since early March when the pandemic first came to light. And I looked at what they focused attention on, and And I've noticed that much of the attention of anti-corruption organizations has focused on illegal activity, so fraud, bribery, the procurement and distribution of resources. And of course, this is terribly important, but here's a World Bank report that talks about corruption in the supply chain and delivery service, highlighting that goods and services can be easily stolen from their before reaching their intended beneficiaries. And also highlights corruption in the administration of the response to the health crisis. Salaries intended for health workers are diverted or stolen, for instance, and attention too is focused on the ancillary effects of pandemic. Like here's a report talking about illicit financial flows that'll be easier during the pandemic because the otherwise enforcement agencies who otherwise would have been engaged are not able to be due to stay-at-home orders, for instance. So what forms of corruption should we be concerned about amid COVID-19? Well, I think the obvious answer is all forms of corruption. But the point that I'd like to make is that those kinds of corruption, the structure of corruption and the operating system that was already present in a given context or a given venue will be exacerbated under pandemic circumstances. That what we already have in a given context in terms of corruption will be made worse and will be also highlighted, will be illuminated under pandemic circumstances. So let's talk about Trump's ruling regime, which I've been following, I suppose, most closely during the pandemic with regard to this issue. But before I get to the pandemic, I would say that in a paper that I did for the International Political Science Association a couple of years ago, I highlighted 6 different forms of corruption under Trump. And I should preface this by saying that I go back to ancient definitions of corruption, to biblical, Islamic, that definitions you find in Bible and also in the Quran. That corruption is the betrayal of public trust. So, for instance, if I go to a physician, I expect that physician to be giving me the advice and medicines that are going to serve my interests, right? I don't expect that person, it's a betrayal of trust if in fact they're giving me a drug because they need somebody else, merely need somebody else for their drug trial. That would be a kind of obvious form of betrayal. A less obvious form of indirect betrayal is an institution that is reflected in an institution that has become common since the end of the Cold War. And this is these are people who are called key opinion leaders. That's a term that was created by the pharmaceutical industry. And what it does, it pays under the table or perks prestigious physicians, usually from the prestige institutions, who are considered leaders, and it pays them to promote their pharmaceutical company's drug or equipment in public among the community of physicians. So in public speeches, and even in papers that are in journals and prominent medical journals, and some of these key opinion leaders, of course, are editors, serve on these boards of these journals. So this is a more difficult to see form of corruption, but one that has been charted in Poland in spades. There's a brilliant dissertation about this, and there's a lot of work about it in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, Latin America, it's all over the world, where you have these key opinion leaders who are really being perked by and paid by pharmaceutical companies, but you don't know it. So it's a betrayal of trust that is much more difficult to see. So that's how I see corruption. Much of it today is increasingly betrayal of public trust is legalized, and it's systemic. And that is what I've been charting for the last, 20 years. So getting back to Trump. So what forms of corruption have emerged with regard to legal corruption? There's and which is my third, takes me to my third point. So what is the flagrant fusing of state and private power? So under the pandemic, for instance, we've seen real estate companies that are related to Trump that are getting money from the coronavirus relief package. So we've seen this kind of merging of clear merging of state and private power. With regard to nepotism, we have seen that in spades. And so we have Jared Kushner and other Trump associates and very close political allies who are the beneficiaries of their entities linked to them are the beneficiaries of these packages that are supposed to be aiding small businesses and that are supposed to be providing paycheck relief to people who are otherwise are unemployed. So it has gone, as Nikos said, it's gone to the few at the expense of the many. We also have regulatory capture gone wild. So Nikos mentioned the case of the meatpacking plant. Regulations being drafted by the regulations that were adopted by the government that were basically being drafted by the industry. We have shadow elites and lobbyists coming out of the absolutely coming out of the woodwork, and what the pandemic has highlighted is the structure of relationships and the structure of interconnectedness and favors and reciprocity among political elites. And so we see the pandemic shows us in kind of flagrant fashion the structure of legalized corruption. Now, it is crucial to point out that this legalized corruption is by no means new. I have been charting this for 15 years. It became bipartisan business as usual in Washington well before Trump. And why did Trump's slogan, "Drain the Swamp," why did that resonate so much among regular people in the United States? Well, one reason is because there was a sense of elite corruption. People didn't necessarily know the details, but they understood that the elites were not giving them the spoils that they might have given 30 years ago. And so 30, 40, 50 years ago. So these are new forms of corruption that have emerged. So the things to highlight, the kinds of relationships that we've seen in the past that we should really think about and highlight, pay attention to, probably all over the world going forward, are the relationships that are developing among pharma, among university pharma, with universities and medical schools and, you know, key opinion leaders, and government, because all kinds of things are being done, I'm told, from people, you know, in the inside, that would not have been done under normal circumstances. And there is a history of hidden industry funding through think tanks and through universities. If you want to make something appear neutral and impartial, what you do if you're an industry or if you have an agenda is you set up a think tank or you empower a think tank. You don't, that doesn't disclose where the money is coming from, or a university where it's hidden through some mechanism. And then you hire experts who come out with findings that say exactly what you want to say. And then that becomes part of the public discussion. So I've charted this form of funding, this form of corruption extensively in my book, Unaccountable. And we've seen a lot of this kind of, you know, think tanks, universities getting into the act, being funded by interest, by energy interests, and so on, when it comes to climate change and climate change denial. So in the science arena, there's a huge precedence for this, and we need to pay very close attention to it. In closing, the big question I think that arises from states of emergency is, what is the lasting impact of these emergency measures and the patterns of relationships that are intensified through them, and then all of the other effects, the tanking of the economy, the exacerbating of already great wealth inequalities, and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alina.
Janine.
Sorry, Janine, of course. I mean, you mentioned that unfortunately not too optimistic that pandemic actually strengthened autocratic in liberal governments, but at least from my point of view, the good thing is that it didn't help too much to Trump, and it didn't strengthen his rule, and his corrupt practices didn't help him to stay in power in these circumstances. I'm wondering what Biden will do and his administration with this. Well, let's leave it for the second round. Now let's go to Marcin. Marcin is Polish, as you people watching us may correctly think. Marcin works for many years for different international organizations, but he is also closely related with civil society organizations, with Transparency International. And now he's back to the academia world. And to Marcin, I would like to ask again, I mean, these two general questions, but also I would like to ask him, maybe you will tell us something positive. I mean, what can we do? I mean, in terms of international organizations that you know very well, but also as citizens, you also know very well from around the world how civil society organizations work, and especially those in anti-corruption industry, let's call it like this. But also you're an academician, and already Nikos talked a lot about scientists and academia. I mean, and they are also actors that that could help us in these difficult circumstances. What are your observations? Tell us something positive, if possible.
Grzegorz, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. An excellent conference, excellent panel. And you know, the great thing about being the last speaker is that when you look at the clock, you know that you should already finish half an hour ago. You know, honestly, after such a distinguished speakers, the best thing I could say is, you know, I agree with most of the things which colleagues said. I was expecting, indeed, Janine, that with your last name, you are going to provide some sweet and nice points. But I am agreeing with you, and I think I'm not going to be very optimistic in my remarks. So, Grzegorz, I will really take maximum 10 minutes, and I'll try to answer your questions. I'm going to share some screens with all of you. I also would like to, for those of you who would like to discuss situation in Poland, the best thing I can do is to refer you to the latest article by Grzegorz and Marcin Wasiak, Ustawodawstwo okresu pandemia, korupcja. I think everything is there. I'm going to make my remarks from the perspective of a former head of democratization department, a former evaluator of Greco, partner working closely with TI and UNODC. And I'm not going to make it in my current capacity as a director of Europeum. So, you know, looking at it from the prism of international organizations and civil society. Well, I think the most important thing we should all start with is the context in which the pandemic is striking, and how we are seeing the situation with rule of law and human rights and corruption. I'm going to share with you, and maybe you could put it for our colleagues on social media, the latest report from the Justice Project. And I just want to share with you one important graph. Let me just share it. Hopefully you could see. Here you are. So why I'm saying that? Because I think we should not have this discussion, you know, looking from the helicopter view. The trend over the last 10 years is very clear. I mean, some would even argue the trend started earlier. Decline in the quality of democracy, decline in protection of fundamental rights, major rule of law crisis in certain part of Europe. And if you look at the absence of corruption, you know, recent reports clearly show that it's correlated with rule of law crisis, fundamental rights crisis, democracy crisis, and not surprisingly, a number of countries where, you know, corruption is growing is much higher, that the situation is improving. And I think it is particularly important, and I totally agree with Janine, you know, this trend only accelerated as a result of pandemic. I would also like to argue, and it's great to have two colleagues giving us US perspective, that the rule of law crisis, issues of a growing level of corruption, problems with fundamental rights are not, and we should not only focus on Central Europe. For the last few years, working for OSCE, I've been advising a number of governments in South Europe, Spain, Italy, Malta, Southeast Europe, Western Balkans. We engaged with colleagues from Iceland, you know, UK. So discussion should really not be only about Central Europe. And I would like to offer a few arguments for why things, in my opinion, just like Janine was saying, we are moving from bad to worse. So I'll stop sharing the screen. The link is with you. I wouldn't mind if you put it on the Facebook. So just going back to the three major arguments. Well, actually, before I go to the arguments, you've asked me, Grzegorz, to mention what is the reaction of international community. The best example, I think, is coming from the recent statement of President of Greco, Marin Marcela. I call on all Greco member states to ensure that transparency and accountability are embedded in their public health policies, and that integrity is central to any recovery effort. Conflicts of interest must be avoided. Procurement actions must be carried out with integrity, credibility, and transparency. What is the reaction we can see in general? What we do see is that governments are reacting to the emergent situation created by the pandemic with concentration of executive powers, derogation of rights and freedoms, and the infusion of large amounts of money without proper accountability and limited transparency. So we should not be surprised that the corruption risks are only growing. One would expect, academics would expect, that in this context, political leadership should lead by example, even more so in the times of crisis. Yet, both in Europe and the United States, this has not been the case. Attacking the judiciary and the law enforcement, or using them for partisan political purposes, targeted anti-corruption investigations, silencing or harassing journalists or anyone who has a different view, owing to replace or undermine institutions politicians disagree with, discrediting whistleblowers, or not providing them with protection they should enjoy, ignoring the most basic rules of ethics, at time of dependency, spreading fake news. I mean, those things were already mentioned by my colleagues. Those are not limited to any particular part of Europe. We've seen them in most of the countries we're discussing today. That's why, in terms of a grant corruption, for those of you who know my articles and books, I focus on the issue of political corruption, elections, political parties. I think you actually see all the problems of not implementing Greco recommendations coming from the fourth, third round, and especially now the fifth round of evaluation, which focuses on preventing corruption in central government, including the top executive functions and law enforcement. I would very quickly, Grzegorz, like to focus on 4 points why I think things will get worse. But before we move to that, I just want to share with you some of the statistics, which, when I was preparing for this workshop, I found them particularly interesting. So Transparency International Health Initiative estimates that up to 25% from contracts is lost to corruption every year. Public health professionals estimate that the amount of public health care funds illegally diverted can go up to 30%, according to World Justice Initiative. Just to put this percentage into perspective. So those different organizations are estimating that corruption in the sector, health sector, costs us $500 billion per year, and has a dramatic impact on the quality of care. I don't have the statistics of this year in terms of money going to fight pandemia, but we can imagine, on average, we're losing $500 billion per year. And it should not be surprising, some colleagues probably will ask about recent cases. If you look at the many European countries, indeed, we are losing up to 25% of public contracts due to corruption. But corruption, the abuse of public office for private gains, is about more than just stealing money. And a number of colleagues already mentioned it. It erodes the social contract and corrodes the government's ability to help grow the economy in a way that benefits all citizens, which was mentioned, not just a few. And as always, particularly vulnerable groups suffer the most. As I was mentioning, and all of you know, corruption was a major problem for many European countries before the crisis, but the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the importance of democratic governance for the following reasons. And I'm just going to do a very quick risk analysis. First, governments around the world are playing a much bigger role now in economy to combat the pandemic and provide economic lifelines. The expanded role of the state of the executive is crucial, but it also increases opportunities for corruption. The risk areas are growing. Executive is actually undermining transparency, undermining reporting. We are not seeing a proper ex-post audits. Accountability procedures are undermined. We're seeing less of a close collaboration within parliaments with opposition. We are seeing targeted campaigns against civil society and media. And I'll give you a few examples in a second. Second, as a result of pandemia, I think we all agree that public finances will worsen. Countries will need to prevent even further tax evasions. And the waste and loss of funds, public funds, caused by corruption in public spending will be particularly evident. What was mentioned earlier, and this is something which I am seeing from my research, as a result of pandemic, patronage networks are going to grow. We are going to see state-owned companies receiving privileged treatment, getting additional resources being allocated. We are seeing cases of abuse of state resources, especially when it comes to public media, additional allocations of enormous resources to public media. What we also see is that part of the emergency financing for countries to fight corruption is not properly tracked. We're not seeing proper reporting. It's thanks to mostly investigations done by media, independent media, opposition MPs, NGOs. Those are the groups which are tracking COVID-related spending, not the governments, not the executive who should be doing. What worries me the most, I think, is the massive evidence of impunity. And this will have consequences beyond 2020, 2021 on trust in democratic institutions, in political elites. This evidence of impunity and corruption is particularly threatening for social cohesion. So, and again, I don't want to give any particular examples. I think against this background, the coronavirus presents a perfect storm for corruption. Massive resources are being rushed to address both the health crisis and its economic side effects, while procurement, oversight, and enforcement efforts are relaxed or diminished. Free and independent media and a vibrant society, rather than being protected, are targeted for their role as watchdogs and as they're performing checks on government, fraud, and abuse. I can just give you an example. We could, again, talk for hours about numerous legislation targeting journalists. Those of you who are familiar with the recent COVID legislation in Hungary could see how media was actually targeted with legislation, and Hungarian journalists being afraid that this legislation will be aimed at fighting them in terms of their objective reporting on the pandemic. I could also mention the issue of elections, something very close to my heart. Let me show with you one of the key opinions which we managed to produce when I was still with ODIHR. This is the opinion on elections in draft opinion on act on special rules for the organization of the general elections of the President of the Republic of Poland, which we ODIHR issued in May 2020. We could spend hours talking about US elections. ODIHR EOM report was published a few weeks ago. Two things I would like to bring to your attention, and what was quite evident when it comes to attempts to change election legislation in Poland. The very rash procedure, disregard for international standards when it comes to democratic lawmaking, which all was captured by ODIHR experts looking at the process of how the law was adopted, how the amendments were made. And just to provoke my colleagues from US, what I found particularly interesting when it comes to election report from US elections is actually lack of funding, necessary funding for election administration, to the point that the founder of the Facebook had to provide $400 million of the private funds to the election administration to secure the electoral process. So we are actually going to deal with the consequences in terms of trust in our democratic institutions, undermined parliaments, undermined electoral processes for a decade to come. And I'll stop now because I think questions is what we all want to get now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Well, I'm very sorry that it wasn't optimistic. So I will do some short summary. I mean, forgive me if, as I picked probably not I'm sure not everything, but several things that that were, I think, the strongest in from what I heard from you. So, well, it seems that corruption strengthens and autocratic regimes, illiberal regimes, maybe with some few exceptions given by Alina, and some achievers in democracy, in terms of democracy and the quality of governance. I mean, they may hope that they will do better even under pandemic. Maybe the US after the change of the administration, but for the rest, there is not too big hope. This is what I picked up from your interventions. Governments, administrations are less and less transparent, and at the same time we are more and more transparent towards the governments, because they have new tools to invigilate us and to monitor us as citizens. So this transparency is reversed in a way. We have a lot of uncontrolled, not transparent lobbying, as Nikos mentioned, the meat packaging industry, and also pharma. I mean, doing businesses under pandemia. Old forms of corruption are still there, and are even in a more quantity and severity. And new forms are also more visible, more legal corruption. We are maybe just ahead of new global social conflicts between poor and rich, between those who are, let's say, who feel good in this liberalism, and those who do wars under this new socialism. It doesn't look well. I'm sorry, but and there is one comment I would like to pick up from chat. I mean, we already spent 1 hour and a half, so I think I will pick up on this one comment by Grażyna Lange. She wrote on Facebook that democracy, for the first time, when it confronts pandemia, must come out from the zone of comfort. I think this is not the first time, but maybe this is the first of this kind of situation that takes democracies from out of the zone of control. Maybe this is specific comparing to other crises through which democracies went through already. We had wars, we had crises, economical crises. But for sure, this is not the first time. I'm asking myself if democracy ever was in any zone of comfort. But I mean, to have a closing round and to give you again, we have 20 minutes. Again, the floor. I mean, what can we do? I mean, Alina mentioned that we should strengthen civil society. Nikos mentioned that we should require more responsibility and also transparency from the academia and sciences. I mean, what do you think? I mean, so taking all this account, I mean, shall we expect that the further decline of democracy and I mean, the new end of history, but not as Fukuyama stated years ago, or we can stop? I mean, what is going on, and what could be the ways? And I would start now, maybe from Nikos, and as we have 20 minutes, so please try to be brief and try to give us some hope in 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, absolutely. In fact, that was the point. The point is that in order to solve a problem, you actually have to establish it. You have to analyze it. You cannot do something about it without recognizing the risks. Risk analysis is the first step. So that's what we're doing here. Crisis, as I concluded, is an opportunity for reform. And it is up to us to take advantage of that. I am, in fact, working on this because I believe that given the right incentives, and you can try and find win-win scenarios and areas where interests converge. So, for example, fighting as we are right now with multi-universities, that's an effort that I am working on right now, and it is supported by the National Science Foundation in the United States, is we have several universities and industry partners, regulatory and international partners also, in order to deal with the problem of illegal, substandard, and falsified medicinal products. Everybody has an interest with that. It's brand protection, financial interest, public health, patients, and everyone. When you take advantage of a crisis situation to build a coalition, a task force, whatever it is, in order to do something where everybody gains, then you create a governance model that has staying power, if you manage it and coordinate it properly, beyond the crisis, and for other areas of policy as well. So in my view, the access to information, having the facts, and being able to create consensual knowledge so that we can at least agree on what the problem is, and then we can debate priorities and solutions, is essential. And that is where thinkers, researchers, and academics have a key role to play. It's up to us. And it's up to us to be critical, because that's why we have tenure. We have to be critical. If we weren't, we wouldn't be doing our job. I have to say things like they are and speak truth to power without fearing that I will lose my job. If I don't use this privilege, I am abusing it. So it's up to us to speak up and do this. So that is just one example, one area where we can actually move the needle.
Thank you, Nikos, and thank you for underlining this responsibility of academics. We are all here academics, and academics are watching us, so let's hope they will help. Alina, I mean, let's move to Europe. Alina, can you?
Right. Well, what I would say by way of conclusion is that first we should get our facts right and not leave the people more confused than when we found them. Okay, so the way to solve policy problems is to make them smaller. Some try to reduce their size. This may sound artificially at points, but unless we reduce the size of policy problems, they simply become unsolvable. If we try on this opportunity to solve the pandemics, the chronic health system problems, the corruption in the country, and the democracy, this is definitely a very, bad way to go about it. We're not going to solve any of this. Okay. On the other hand, saying that illiberal regimes profit out of this more than democracies, I think is not supported by the facts. Look, Trump already had paid some bill for the pandemics. It was a part of the explanation for which he lost. Bolsonaro is also going to pay the bill, right? So I would not say that it's the autocrats who pay more, because I really think there is no statistical significance here. I really think that, people are penalized. Some autocrats are, some autocratic minded. I wouldn't really call Trump an autocrat. Some autocratic-minded people who are disrespectful towards rule of law paid the bill for the pandemic, and more of them will pay. Just wait and see. But also, unfortunately, some Democrats will also pay the bill, like Macron. Macron seems to be, the country which invented the social contract, seems to be daily, without a social contract. It's really pitiful what goes on there. The fact that there seems to be no trust between the government and the population, and this is not making better their anti-pandemics policies and no other policies. So no, illiberalism will not profit out of this. I really don't think so. Okay, but neither shall we profit out of this. In the end of the day, to say that, we can take advantage of a crisis which exposes these chronic problems to solve them has only one quality. This statement, it is an optimistic statement, and doctors know, as well as economists, that people who score high on optimism are likely to live a little bit more, or if that's about countries, to have their economies grow more. So optimism is a value in itself, but on the other hand, it is really, really not a scientific fact. And if I am allowed to be the scientist here, I would just want to say that no, we're not going to take advantage of this crisis to solve corruption problems. Epidemics from whenever they happened, they only brought about shortages, black markets. So an epidemics is really an environment where speculation flourishes, not good governance. However, and I will, end with this, I think that some people already found smaller, if we look to smaller problems, those that we can really tackle, I think that some avenues were already pointed out and they're interesting, and we should all try to, push that door open. For instance, IMF is giving now money to over 80 countries on corona-related aid, right? Of course, this money, if you believe in my model, is necessarily bad money. In other words, it goes to the side of the balance, which provides more opportunities for corruption, right? But they are aware of this. They are more than aware of this. And therefore, this money comes with stronger conditionalities than ever before. However, I think, I have a better opinion about these conditionalities because they are all post factum conditionalities. They are audits and things like this, which we know from literature, they don't work. We have even special literature related to IMF that post factum conditionality doesn't work. However, all this is ongoing. We can still influence it. We can all petition World Bank and IMF to ask them that while they give this money, and they have to give this money, there's no discussion. The whole world is into this and we have to redress the economy. There's no discussion that you can tell a country you're corrupt, you're not going to have this money because I know you're going to profit disproportionately out of it, you as ruler compared to the rest of the population. But what we can do is to open things that we will develop after the pandemic is gone. For instance, public procurement portals for people who do not have. Let's start by having a portal where we put this money for corona aid. We've seen what happened in Indonesia. A minister was arrested for taking a kickback from corona aid. But this was possible because there was sufficient transparency to follow what happened with this aid. This is in a way an opportunity, all this money flowing into countries, to have a little bit of more control, not on the country's finance in general, but on the money which goes there. And develop these seeds of transparency and of tracking the funds, which can, after the pandemic is over, developed into places from which we will build public expenditure tracking systems, public portal systems, and other things that we do in our everyday works and which we know advance good governance. Because again, we have to return to narrower issues that we can solve. Part of other issues will solve themselves, or we will solve them under better conditions than what we have presently. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Alina. Just short additional question, because from the yesterday's panel, I know that you had presidential elections in Romania, and a friend from Romania was very optimistic about. Is this anyhow linked to what we are talking about today? And are you also optimistic about?
Okay, Romania had legislative elections, not presidential elections. And, there is no clear majority, and a general is appointed as interim president and with big chances to become a prime minister. So no, I would not point as Romania as an optimist case. Romania is a country where, secret services play a disproportionate role in politics. And that came to be more important than whatever are the results in elections, which I would really think it's very bad, although we don't get as many headlines as Poland and Hungary.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's move to the US again, and we will end up with Europe and Great Britain and Poland, because Marcin combines everything. Janine.
Great, yeah, thank you. So just to clarify, so my point about authoritarian leaders, regimes, is not just about those regimes, but it is about leaders and many others who will take advantage of emergency situations in whatever context they're working in, whether it's a democracy or classified as by many as an authoritarian regime. So, and with regard to Trump may have lost the election, but Trump and Trumpism have not disappeared. Almost half the electorate voted for him. He may well be back to run again. And the phenomenon of Trumpism is not only in the United States, but around the world is is to be contended with for years to come. And this leads to my 2 points that I'd like to stress. What can we do? 2 people have mentioned on the panel that have mentioned the issue of trust. It is crucial to understand that that public opinion polls the world over, I mean, not just in democratic countries, but many others, have shown that over the past 30 some years, regular people have lost faith in all manner of public institutions, from those of government to those of the media to business institutions. So why is that happening, and what does that mean? Well, that's a subject of research that I'm working on, but certainly it's clear to me, especially from a U.S. Having studied governance in the U.S. over many years, that government itself needs to be reclaimed, rebuilt, insourced, made robust again, anew. It's been being eroded now for 30, 40 years. So part of the reason I think people have, little trust in institutions is that they're not delivering in the way that they used to deliver for regular people, and people know that. So institutions need to be rebuilt, and that should have some effect on how the extent to which people trust in them. And related to that is the necessity, and this is something that we can all do and all should be doing, is to really work towards rebuilding community at the, whatever level we are working in, the local level. So what does that mean? It means talking with people, trying to understand the perspectives of people that we don't normally deal with. Why would somebody vote for Trump? Well, there are a lot of people out there who I don't agree with them. Trump has made things exponentially worse, but there's a reason they voted for him. So I need to understand that we need to get a handle on what has gone wrong in, not only American societies, but societies around the world that has created this state of affairs that we're in. So we need to really engage along all kinds of polarized lines now more than ever at the local level. Thank you.
Okay, Marcin, your last words, and I also see that you wanted to comment as well, so you can do everything now. 5 minutes.
No, I normally, if we were in Warsaw, if it was not for COVID, I would hug Janine, because everything she said, it just brings Americans so close to us Europeans that, I've been working with different American organizations for the last 25 years. And when we had discussions about the quality of democracy, our American friends were usually acting from a position of power, thinking, their democracy is perfect. We Europeans, we have many problems which we have to fix with populism, with toxic polarization. And, it took you a long way welcome back, welcome to the said family. You are facing the problems which we've been facing in Europe for decades, where they were well covered. But I think, if one of the things which, positive, you asked for positive, I think, Grzegorz, pandemia will bring US, Europe closer together. We are going to see a closer collaboration in transatlantic dialogue, not only in terms of how to protect, how to, enhance our democracy, but we are going to see it also, I think, in terms of a research collaboration. So, maybe in the moments of crisis, this is where you meet your true friends. And maybe, we needed to go through this crisis also to improve our, US-European relations. But indeed, what Janine said is just, Janine, you could say exactly the same things being in a South Europe, in Central Europe. Those are the problems, this toxic polarization, lack of trust. Do you know, Janine, that in every European country, more people believe in life on Mars than they trust political parties? The level of trust in key democratic institutions is so low. And, so those are the common problems. But Grzegorz, 3 concrete things I think we should focus on. Maybe, and again, I'm going to share with you a screen, maybe it's time to discuss for some of our European countries to join Council of Europe Medicrime Convention. This is a very important convention, and you would be surprised, even a place from which you are now organizing this event, even Poland is not a member of this convention. So there is a room to improve international legal framework in terms of fighting corruption related to medical crimes. Second, a very important issue, again, something which we could learn from US, and we should learn from US, is fighting with impunity. After Katrina hurricane crisis, by 2011, there were more than 1,500 people being investigated for corruption-related crimes. I have a lot of interactions with colleagues from FBI. Americans know how to fight impunity. Trump was trying to change that. He was indeed undermining many important investigations. But when it comes to impunity, this is something which I see as a major threat for Europe, for certain European countries, EU countries. Discussions which are taking place in Brussels this week are very important, because how you could protect that European funds are spent in accountable, transparent way if you cannot secure independent prosecution, independent judiciary. Who is going to investigate those cases of corruption if you have a politically controlled prosecution and you do not have independent courts? That's the challenge, So those discussions which are taking place in Brussels are also very relevant for post-COVID recovery and how we're going to use European funds. And we should learn from our American colleagues that in a 21st century democracy, there's no room for impunity. And the third point, I would say again, Grzegorz, Batore Foundation, and others are very important players, and I would encourage you, do support academic networks, do support academics like colleagues who are on this panel today, because I think in this era of fake news, research-driven policies, academia is the last bastion of independent quality research. And we need more researchers looking at the issue of anti-corruption. We cannot allow academics working on anti-corruption to go through the same drama colleagues working on gender equality are going through right now in Central Europe. I am afraid that after media, independent media, after NGOs, academics working on anti-corruption might be the next target of attacks. And we will see limitations to their research funding and ability to conduct independent academic research. And this would be something I would like to finish on. We need to support independent academics working on anti-corruption, because they will provide data for NGOs, for think tanks, and for independent journalists.
Thank you, Marcin, and big thanks to all of you for excellent speeches. And I'm happy that I think in the end ended with a little bit optimism. Thank you, Marcin, for advertising my colleague Marcin Waszak's short piece on Polish anti-pandemic legislation and corruption. It will be translated into English, so I hope it will also serve as a source of knowledge to others. And I'm waiting for your papers, for your research, for next conferences to watch you. thanks once again, especially to guests from the US. I really appreciate that you woke up so early. And have a good day, and see you in a better times and in reality. Thank you, and thank you for all organizers of this event, and to translators and to the audience. Thank you.
And thank you to